With a deep sense of joy, we present to you Brother Hugh Nibley, a servant of the Lord. Brother Nibley.
He's about to have his wish to hear something corny gratified, I think. Keep thinking of the scripture, how can they believe who receive honor from one another? If we get any honor at all, it'll be from the Lord, and he's laughing at us all the time, I'm sure. He knows what we're really like. Well, brethren and sisters, recently in our family night, I'm supposed to talk about the meaning of the temple. Any field of serious study today is necessarily highly specialized, and at the same time, it calls for branching out into related fields, so we've got to appeal to this stuff. As it's very good. It's beyond the popularizing of another day, and especially because of the marvelous processes of photographic reproduction today, these magnificently illustrated books on every branch of science that are now available. Last week we talked about P.T. Matthews' The Nuclear Apple, and before that it was the biologist Lyle Watson's book Supernature, and before that Nigel Calder's broad survey of recent studies of the brain called The Mind of Man. And that same writer, Nigel Calder, works for BBC, and he goes around all over the world getting up programs of very high caliber, surveying recent astronomical developments. He goes to every astronomer in the world and consults with them and builds up these programs. That was called The Violent Universe. That was required reading. It probably still is in our honors program. And he recently has one out on geological, the new geology, the plate tectonics, which he calls The Restless Earth. The titles of these books are significant. The Violent Universe, The Restless Earth, Supernature. That wasn't the way I heard it when I went to school. In my day, everything was pretty well under control. At best, we had tolerant scientific smiles for anything suggesting catastrophism, or anything dramatic or spectacular events in history or in nature. This was one of the apocalyptic visions of Mormonism, was one of the things that's classed in the lunatic fringe. That was apocalyptic sensationalism. There was just no place in modern thinking for that sort of thing. But all these books, regardless of their fields, all these books in their various branches, the interesting thing is they're all saying the same thing now. They all come to this very interesting conclusion. A few quotations will show what I mean. First, there's one basic proposition that's receiving particular attention in all of them. The well-known second law of thermodynamics, that everything runs down. And it's being stated with strong and bemused reservations because there's something wrong with it. Now, let's quote Lyle Watson, the biologist. They tell me he's very good. He has a great reputation in England. He says, left to itself, everything tends to become more and more disorderly until the final and natural state of things is a completely random distribution of matter. Any kind of order is unnatural and happens only by chance encounters. These events are statistically unlikely, and further combination of molecules into anything as highly organized as a living organism is wildly improbable. Life is rare and is a rare and unreasonable thing. He labors this point. He says later, life occurs by chance, and the probability of its occurring and continuing is infinitesimal. There's no chance of our being here at all. The cosmos itself is patternless, being a jumble of random and disordered events. Now, the nuclear physicist, P.T. Matthews, goes to this concept with more detail. He says the logarithm of the number of different states in which a system can be found is called entropy. Thus, the entropy of tidy or ordered states is very much less than that of untidy or disorderly states. How much less? By a factor of some 24 to 10 million. That's the difference. The chance of thing being ordered, just 24 in that many. Defining an ordered or tidy state as one in which the cards are arranged by value in successive suits, we're quoting here, he finds there are just 24 such configurations which arise from the different possible orderings of the suits. While in our 52-card deck, there are 10 to the 52 power, that's 8 times, you see. Possible disorderings. See, the chance of disorder is that. The chance of order, this is the way he puts it. Remember, the biologist says it was wildly improbable. rare and unreasonable. The chance is infinitesimal. He puts it just as strongly. He finds the human being is at very least an assembly of chemicals constructed and maintained in a state of fantastically complicated organization of quite unimaginable improbability. So improbable you can't even imagine it. So utterly impossible even to mention it is ridiculous. So we have no business being here. In fact, well, that's what they're saying. That is not the natural order of things. In fact, he says the sorting process, the creation of order out of chaos, which is essential to life, is entirely unnatural, against the natural flow of physical events. So the physical scientists and naturalists agree that if nature has anything to say about it, we wouldn't be here. This is the paradox that Professor Wald of Harvard, who was last semester up at the U, before that up at the U of U, solved so paradoxically by sticking to his guns. It happens, he says, but it still can't happen. It's impossible. The chances of our being here are just not even to be thought of, but there we are. So I say, in my school days, it was fashionable to brush aside the Paley's watch argument with a snort of impatience. If you're walking on the beach and you find a fine, beautiful Swiss watch, you would conclude that some intelligent mind has produced the watch, wouldn't you? Well, not a bit of it, they said. It proves nothing of the sort. Finding the watch only proves that mere chance at work, if given enough time, can indeed produce a fine Swiss watch or anything else. Quite seriously. Indeed, when you come right down to it, the fact that Swiss watches exist in a world created and governed entirely by chance proves that blind chance can produce watches. There is no escaping this circular argument, and they work it. Today, Professor Matthews states the same problem more simply. He says, if after seeing a room in chaos, it is subsequently found in good order, the sensible inference is not that time is running backwards, but that some intelligent person has been in to tidy it up. If you find the letters of the alphabet ordered on a piece of paper to form a beautiful sonnet, you do not deduce that teams of monkeys have been kept for millions of years strumming on typewriters, but rather that Shakespeare has passed that way. But now you laugh at that, but for Professor Huxley or Professor Simpson, this is sheer heresy. It was the evolutionists who seriously did put forth the claim that an ape strumming on a typewriter for long enough time could produce by mere blind chance all the books in the British Museum. Friends actually made, showing that chance could prove it. But was such boundless faith ever expressed by any religionist? I don't know any religious person that ever had greater faith than that, but they seriously believed it. You're asking for the impossible. They say it's impossible and it happens. In mixing the cards, the decay interaction is the shuffling agent. And by the second law of thermodynamics, essentially every proton would by now have decayed into lighter particles. Clearly, the opposite is the case. Now we're quoting Matthews, says there must be some very exact law which is preventing this from happening. Kammerer's new law of seriality is in direct opposition to the second law. He says there is a force that tends towards symmetry and coherence in bringing like and like together. That's Kammerer's law of seriality. That's a very interesting thing. So we say like cleaveth unto like and so forth. Well, what is that force? Nobody knows. They say it's there because we see it's working. That's all we know. The greatest Russian astrophysicist today, their foremost man in that field, Nikolai Kozyrev, has been working for years on this thing. He says second thermodynamics is all right, but it doesn't work. There's something working against it, something stronger. He says we don't know what it is. We haven't the vaguest idea, but it is there. We're beginning to realize with the Egyptians and the Jews that when we speak of everything, we must include that we are not aware of, along with what we are aware of. We just heard about that. And recognize that as the overwhelming greater quantity. See, what we're not aware of is part of the calculation, must be used. We've never used it before. We just heard, you see, anything you haven't experienced doesn't exist. Gertrude doesn't see the ghost standing there. She doesn't see the king. So Hamlet did, and she says, what do you see? He said, nothing at all. She says, yet all that is I see. Well, that's perfectly all right. Her testimony is that she doesn't see anything. She had no right to add, but all that is I see. If it's not there, if I don't see it, it's not there because I see everything that's there. How do you know? Because somebody else is seeing something else. Well, it's the same thing here. The Egyptian word for everything is netchetutet. Everything I know and everything I don't know. Everything we're aware of and everything we're not aware of makes up everything. So you can't just say everything, it's just everything I happen to know. And the Jewish rabbis, this is their particular strength. This is the particular honesty of the Jews. that they always include that unknown factor when they talk about anything, including what we don't know as well as what we do know, with the recognition that what we're not aware of is much the bigger part of the picture. Of course it is, too. Now we read, this is what Calder says in The Restless Earth. For all who inhabit this planet, the Earth's sciences now supply a new enlightenment, tantamount to a rediscovery of the Earth. And this new knowledge has all come forth since the mid-1960s, as a result of which, suddenly, he says, geology makes sense. But what did geology make all those other years I've been at the BYU? The mid-1960s isn't so far away, but he says it's like the discovery of a new world now, something completely different. At last, we are told by the brain specialists, in our own time, the first attempts at using computers, well, this is Noam Chomsky, in using computers for translation of foreign language texts have been an expensive failure. Noam Chomsky played an important part in stopping the computer people and their patrons wasting more effort on this hopeless task. I can remember I used to share an office with Boster, the first person who tried to work on a Russian translating machine. That was way back in the 1940s. And he went to Georgetown University and took over the project there. They worked for 30 years and then gave it up. It just wouldn't work. But they were all enthusiastic. There's no problem we can't solve. The computer's going to solve everything for us. It's gone down the drain now. We're now assured that it was only a working assumption that the mind and the brain are inseparable. And Ralph Berry, who's been doing a lot with this, says the brain transcends the property of its cells. There is something up and above beyond the brain, and this is a thing that's having a very important influence today. The nuclear physicist, speaking on the same subject, says, between the electrical signals coming through the eye to the brain and our reaction to a tree in blossom on a fresh spring day, there is a vast gap which physics shows no signs of ever being able to bridge. It may be that whatever is peculiar to life and particular to thought lies outside the scope of physical concepts. I was also surprised to learn that in the field of the relationships of the particle within a nucleus, this nuclear physics, no problem, we're quoting now, no problem in this field is exactly soluble. With the present mathematical techniques, we have no idea of how to cope with these problems. In mathematics, there's no sign that we'll ever be able to solve these problems. We just do it by approximation as near as we can get to it. Now, two things stand out in all this. The first is the awareness of an organizing, ordering force in the universe that's very active and is running counter to all we know of the laws of science. And the second is the awareness of the great gaps in our knowledge that may account for our failure to discover the source of that force. And this takes us directly to the subject of the temple. You'd never guess it, but this has been the subject on the meaning of the temple. We talk a lot about the second law. Well, what about the first law? That's important, too. That's the law of the conservation of energy, which is the conservation of mass and matter, too, in all its forms, naturally. With that law, the Latter-day Saints have never had any quarrel. We've always believed that. The Christian world has, with its doctrine of creation out of nothing, gratiat nihilo. Recently, H.J. Weiss has written a very good book on Jewish Hellenistic thought, and he's shown there at great length that the idea of creation out of nothing was totally unknown to the Christian or the Jewish doctors before the 4th century A.D. It had nothing to do with their doctrines. They always taught in the early church, and the Jews too, that the world was organized out of matter that was already there. Now, this was a Mormon teaching that was greatly offensive, because we say, well, God created the world out of nothing. But we don't quarrel with that first law of the conservation of energy. Surprisingly enough, we also accept the second law. We accept that too. In the course of nature, that law takes its relentless course. What Jacob says, this corruption could not put on incorruption. There was no chance of it. It was a one-way process that was irreversible. Notice he puts this to his son. Jacob is writing in the Book of Mormon, 2 Nephi. This corruption could not put on incorruption. Wherefore, the fate of death which came upon man must needs have remained to endless duration. It couldn't be reversed. Incorruption could put on corruption. The thing could decay and break down. Particles break down into smaller and lighter particles, but you can never reverse the process. But something is making reverse, and this is what they talk about. It's baffling everybody, you know. In fact, Brother Eyring up at the U talked about that years ago. You see, the theory that the universe was exploding, it was wound up tight, but what wound it up? You see, had to start out with that. Well, this corruption could not put on incorruption, wherefore this death and decay that came upon man must needs have remained to an endless duration. And notice he rubs it in now. If so, this flesh must have lain down to rot and to crumble. That's what to disintegrate into Mother Earth. To rise no more. That's the law of nature, he says. He calls that the first law. That is the second law, and according to Jacob, it is the first law to which our natures are subjected. The inexorable and irreversible trend toward corruption and disintegration. Can't be reversed. To rise no more, to crumble, to rot, to remain that way endlessly, for endless duration. It couldn't reverse the order. Well, this would spell finish to everything, were it not that there's another force working against it. Wherefore, it needs must be an infinite atonement, he says. A principle of unlimited application and effect. There is an infinite principle at work here. Save it should be infinite. He insists on that. It can't be limited. It can't be provisional. It can't be an expediency. It is an infinite principle just as much as the other principle is. An infinite atonement. This corruption could not put on incorruption. We cannot save ourselves from entropy. Someone else is there to do it. Notice what atonement means. It means reversal. It means reversing the process, returning to its former state, being united again. What you have when particles break down, they separate, don't they? Decay is always from heavier to lighter particles. But atonement is bringing a particle back to one again, bringing anything back to its one original state at one moment, bringing it back to the way it was before. Now, according to the law of nature, and that's the way Jacob puts it, according to the first principle, that could never happen. It would never be brought back again unless it was a principle of atonement, bringing things back together again, and this is what he's talking about, working. This infinite principle. We noted that both the physicist and the biologist were aware of an ordering and organizing agent that is opposing the second law. Such ordering and organizing is peculiarly the work of mind, according to Matthews, and is expressed in some baffling and inexplicable way in which he says the inanimate world is controlled by laws which can only be put in mathematical terms. He pays tribute to the Pythagoreans there. What does an atom know of eigenvalues, he asked, or a hadron, or a theory of the theory of unitary groups? For that matter, what do I know about it? Yet all of inanimate nature conducts itself according to mathematical principles, conceived of as pure theory by the human mind. Somebody must be working things out. And so we begin with the temple story. Yonder is matter. That's the first law. Matter was always there. Yonder is matter unorganized. Remember what his name says? Watson says, the normal state of matter is chaos. It always is, it always will be. The normal state of matter is to be unorganized. So we begin with our story, yonder is matter unorganized. Let us go down and organize it into a world. That's a mysterious somebody at work bringing order into chaos. Now you say you're just making up a story. Yes, you'd just be making up a story if we didn't have a world to prove it, that somebody had organized it, see. Somebody went down and organized it. No, we have it given. There was absolutely, there was matter always there, and it was always in its normal state of chaos, and long ago the protons should have all broken down and so forth, but here we have the world. So, this is the story. Matter is unorganized. Notice the temple represents that organizing principle in the universe that brings all things together. And it's the school where we learn about these things. Why did the Egyptians build temples? This is a very interesting insight, I think. Recently, Philip Dershain has rediscovered, and edited a very important, very early Egyptian temple document. It's the Salt Papyrus 825. It's been known for 100 years, but nobody realized what it was until he discovered it, really. He begins by noting that the Egyptians felt themselves surrounded by an omnipresent and ever-threatening chaos. They were intensely conscious of the second law of breaking down. You see, it haunts them. They're hypnotized, almost paralyzed by the terror of this breaking down. And, of course, there's no place where you'll find more dramatic and uncompromising descriptions of the processes of decay and evils of death than in the Egyptian funerary texts. They hate it, they loathe it, but they look it in the eye anyway. Order and security are the exception in this world. It would seem the Egyptians entered the land in a time of great world upheavals. Their own accounts are full of it. They're always talking about that. They had seen nature on the rampage, and they knew that man is hanging by the skin of his teeth. This is another thing, catastrophes, and they tell us about the great Triassic catastrophe now. They reintroduced catastrophe. The great German biologist Schindler, what they call neo-catastrophism, but it's a different picture. When you give titles to books like The Violent Universe, how un-Victorian that is, or The Restless Earth, the Earth is stability itself, as lasting, as unshaken as the hills, and so forth. Now all you have to do is look at the daily paper to realize it isn't the way it is at all. The same thing applied in Babylonia. We read that the proto-temples of Babylonia, the Tower of Babel, was built as a place in which to accumulate data and master the knowledge necessary to counteract, to meet, to check, to soften any major world catastrophe that was scared to death, having memories of the flood, which was altogether too near. Of the Egyptians, Dershain writes, they believed that by the mind, by the esprit alone, chaos is kept at a distance. This implies that the cessation of thought would ipso facto mark the end of the universe. We're still quoting from Dershain here. Now, this was the great fear of the Egyptian. The most constant preoccupation of endlessly repeated rites was to achieve unlimited, everlasting stability. It was not the temple which could pretend to be built for eternity. Eternity was static time, hierophantic time, using the word of his great colleague, which could only be attained by a constant effort of the mind. You have to keep working at it all the time. This was by the operation of the Spirit alone that things were effectively preserved from annihilation. I'm reminded here of that, the marvelous fourth book of Nephi, one chapter long. It describes the model society and how it went to pot. And you say, my land, they lived in a happy time, didn't they? And of course, happy the people whose annals are blank. He doesn't tell us anything about it because there's nothing to report. It wasn't catastrophic. There were crimes, no wars. But why did they lose it? Because it was too strenuous. It required much greater mental... And he said we spent our time constantly in meetings and prayer and fasting and concentrating on things. And the exercise of the mind was just too exhausting. It was easy just to give it up and let things drift. And they went back into their own ways. They had to work hard to preserve that marvelous order of things. Between the forces that create and the force that destroyed, where the Egyptians figure it out, the Egyptian saw himself as a third source, as a third force. He's in between. His business is to conserve, to preserve, to keep things much as they are as possible. Because there is a force that creates and there is a force that destroys. We're between. But he could conserve, says Dershain, only by la pensée, by thought, actualized by symbolic words or gestures. Along with this urgency went a feeling of total responsibility, which in return called for action. The basic rite of the temple was sacrifice. Now, the point that interests us here is just how the Egyptians thought they could contribute to upholding the physical world order by purely symbolic indications of thought. As Dershain notes, after all, it was thought that really counted. Yet the symbols are important. We have them to direct, to concentrate, to discipline, to inform the thought. To be effective, thought must be so motivated and directed. Watson's Supernature has a great deal to say on this subject. The one thing that all the experimenters in psychokinesis and telepathy and ESP and all the borderline probings into the workings of the mind, which in our day are being undertaken with such astonishing results by the most skeptical people on earth, mostly Russians, yet they're getting these. But they all agree on this, that whatever the task is set, successful performance is directly related to the power of concentration, to the will, to the desire, and the total interest and involvement. The person has to be excited, and then he can do amazing things. But if the interest isn't kept at a high level, and the concentration, there's nothing much goes on. But when you can get that, the mind actually has direct effect on things. This is the point. They can do astonishing things just by thought now. We know that, but it's this business of concentrating it and ordering it. This is illustrated in the ancient prayer circle in the temples. There's a lot of when your thoughts concentrated in a single they form a structure, and this has a definite significance. I have a lot of stuff on this. I won't go into it. For the Egyptians and Babylonians, as for us, the temple represents the principle of order in the universe. I said before, it is the heliocentric point around which all things are organized. It is the Eben Setiah, around which the earth was organized. See, the temple is a scale model of the universe. It is boxed to the compass. It is very important to every town in our whole civilization, just as the ancient world. Now, years ago, you may remember, began when Sir James Fraser noticed that there was a definite pattern among ancient religious cult practices and so forth. They all followed into the same patterns throughout the whole world. He explained that as representing certain stages of evolution in which the mind naturally expressed itself in those forms. But since then, the gaps between these various cultures have been filled in and show that there is really one civilization, and it is herocentric, centered around this holy point. And the temple is certainly the center of things in Babylonia, in Egypt, Greece, wherever you go. And this was so in Utah. This structure was revived, of course, by the church. Everybody locates himself in Deseret with reference to the temple. The street is first, second, third, east, west, north, or south, depending on the temple. The temple is boxed to the compass. You go up to the west end, you see the dipper represented there. That's very important. See, the Egyptian temple, you had to have the dipper there, indicating the North Star, around which all things pivot. The main gate must face the east and so forth. The carefully boxed, it must be in 3 levels, as it is. Must have the sun, the moon, and the stars. The 3 degrees are represented there. What you have here is a scale model of the universe for teaching purposes and for a purpose of taking our bearings on the universe and in the eternities, both in time and in place. That's in time, and of course, as far as time is concerned, we take the center there. We're in the middle, working for those who've been before and what shall come after. We're transferring. Remember, our ancestors, we have our records. All the records, quite recently, remember, the genealogy records were kept in the basement of the Salt Lake Temple. They belong in the temple. Okay. And because this is work for people who've lived long ago, which makes it possible for them to project their existences into what's to come in the future. We're standing in the middle. It's in this middle position. This is Midgard. This is the Middle Earth here. The Marcus Shemamwer Erzirtzim, the Babylonians, they call it the Marcas, means the tying knot, the knot that ties all horizontal distances together and all up and down, Shemamwer Erzirtzim, of the heavens and the earth. It's the middle point at which the worlds above and which the worlds below meet. I mention this when we come to the idea of celestial here in a minute. This scale model of the universe is a templum. Of course, the word templum is the Latin. It means the same thing as a template. It's a place where you cross. The templum was a design drawn on the earth, and the augur, the person who was going to take auguries either by the birds or by the heavens, would sit in the center of this and take his bearings with regard to this carefully laid out observatory. And this is represented in the ancient stone circles you find of great antiquity, most of them, over 200 of them in England, and in France, throughout the ancient world you find them. They're the form and model of the Egyptian temple, too, as far as that goes. Always taking your bearing because it's an observatory. That's what a templum is, where you take your bearings on things. More than that, it's a working model, a laboratory for demonstrating basic principles. It deals with figures and symbols to convey to finite minds things beyond their immediate experience. There the man Adam, first concerned to seek for further light and knowledge. His zeal is rewarded by bestowal from above of principles and ordinances that he is to study and transmit to his children. The temple is the great teaching institution of the human race. Universities are much older than was ever expected. The university began as a museum, the temple of the muses, who represented all departments of knowledge. It's the Egyptian, they call it the House of Life. It was an observatory, a great megalithic complex with amazingly sophisticated devices for observing and recording the motions of the heavens. The new studies on Stonehenge show that it was a computer of great accuracy. It was a Garden of Eden. This university is set in the midst of sacred groves where all life is sacrosanct. It's often been said that the temple was the source of all civilization. Just a brief statement here from a recent article here. The House of Life is where the books were copied and studied, had been from the earliest times the aspect of a university, a supergraduate school. This was in Egypt. Gardner spent a lot of time on that. There it was that all questions relating to learned matters were settled, he says. The place was always, now every ancient civilization had this as its core. The place was always part of the temple. The books contained the earliest poetry. There's the word poet. For the word poema, as the Walter Otto in his book on the Musen has shown, the word poetry means creation. Poema means the creation of the world. The business of the muses at the temple was to sing the creation song with the morning stars. Naturally, because there was dramatized the story of the creation, too. Naturally, the hymn was sung to music, and some scholars would derive the first writing from musical notation. It was performed in a sacred circle or chorus, so that poetry, music, and the dance go together. Lucian's famous essay on the ancient dance takes that back to the round dance in the temple, which was, remember, the earliest accounts, we have many of them, of the prayer circle that Jesus used to hold with the apostles and their wives. Jesus standing at the altar in the office of Adam, and their wives standing around them. Some it's referred to as a dance. It's a chorus. So that poetry, music, and dance go out to the world from the temple, called by the Greeks the museum, the shrine of the muses. The creation hymn was part of the great dramatic presentation that took place yearly at the temple, dealing with the fall and redemption of man, represented by various forms of combat, making the place a scene of ritual athletic contests, sanctified throughout the world, the sacred games, of course. The victor in the contest was the father of the race, the priest-king himself, whose triumphant procession, coronation, and marriage took place on the occasion, making this the seat and source of government. This is where all government comes from the temple, not from the palace. Since the entire race was expected to be present for the event, a busy exchange of goods from various distant regions took place. This was what the Greeks call a panegyris, assembly of the entire human race in a circle. The booths of pilgrims serving as market booths for great fairs, while the necessity of converting various and bizarre forms of wealth into acceptable offerings for the temple led to an active banking and exchange in the temple courts. The earliest money from Juno Moneta, who had the temple on the hill in the capital, and the main temple was at the capital, and there was the temple of Juno Moneta.
This is the end of Side 1. You may turn the tape over now to continue the program.
An exchange in the temple courts. The earliest money from Juno Moneta, who had the temple on the hill in the capital, and the main temple was at the capital, and there was the temple of Juno Moneta, the defending Juno, and the coins. See, at the temple you had to bring an offering. No one comes empty-handed, but you couldn't come from a great distance and bring something, a pure dove or a... So you would go to exchange a token for one when you got to the temple so you could make your offering. And that's, remember, Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple. They were in the courts there, changing the various money and also dealing in goods here. It was full of lambs and doves. So it's the center of banking and of all exchange. Since the place served as an observatory, all things were tied to the calendar and the stars. Mathematics flourished and astronomy was a muse. History was another muse, for the rites were meant for the dead as well as the living. And memorials to former great ones, believed to be in attendance, encouraged the production of marvelous art of portraiture, of sculpture and painting. Remember, the Romans had no art, but they had marvelous art of portraiture. Their ancestral busts were amazingly lifelike. You know what the form of bust is? It's cut off here because it represents the person emerging from the earth. He's being rescued or he's being redeemed from death. That's why the bust is cut off so far. It was an Egyptian custom taken over, which would have flourished anyway, that is art, as in architectural adornments, because the design, the measurements, the midot of the temple structure are very significant. As we said, it was a scale model of the universe. And the cosmic computer, they were all important to have the correct measurements. Architecture of the heliocentric structures of prime concern. Since from that central point all the earth was measured and all the lands distributed, geometry was essential. The writings produced and copied in the House of Life were also discussed there, giving rise to philosophy, that concerned largely with cosmology and natural science. In short, there is no aspect of our civilization which does not have its rise in the temple. Thanks to the power of the written word there, they kept the records and the like. In the all-embracing relationship of the divine book, everything is relevant. Nothing is really dead or forgotten. Remember, in the time of gatherings, when we gather all things together, not just people, but we gather everything good that ever was, that nothing shall be lost, that everything shall be restored in this last dispensation. Everything is to be restored and gathered together. In an all-embracing relationship, nothing is really dead or forgotten. Every detail belongs in the picture, which would be incomplete without it. Lacking such a synthesizing principle, our present-day knowledge becomes ever more fragmented. Our universities and libraries crumble and disintegrate as they expand. Where the temple that gave its birth is missing, civilization itself becomes a hollow shell. We have to have the temple there as the core of all our civilizations. This is not just a myth. In 1930, they began to notice this at Cambridge. The Cambridge School got calling them patternism, what they taught there, because they said, well, the ancient religions all fall into the same pattern, and this is it. In the temple, we are taught by symbols and examples. Now, this is not the fullness of the gospel. One common thing, one argument that's very popular today, look, you say the Book of Mormon contains the fullness of the gospel. It doesn't contain the temple ordinances in it, does it? That's not the fullness of the gospel. That's like entering into a laboratory to confirm what we've already learned in the classroom and from the text. The fullness of the gospel is the story of what it's all about, the knowledge necessary to salvation. You want the whys and wherefores, the fullness of the gospel, you go to Nephi, to Alma, to Moroni. Then you'll enter into the lab, not in total ignorance. The ordinances are mere forms. They do not exalt us. They merely prepare us to be ready in case we ever become eligible. And such teachings make the event more likely, too, that we will become eligible. We've been assuming, almost unconsciously, notice, that our temple is the same class as those of the Egyptians. Now we have to explain that. The ordinances of the Egyptian temple were essentially the same as those performed in ours. And that's explained very simply. They have a common origin. The clue is given in Abraham 26, 1, 26, and 27, when he says, Pharaoh, being a righteous man, established his kingdom and judged his people wisely and justly, seeking earnestly to imitate that order established by the fathers in the first generations in the days of the first patriarchal reign, even in the reign of Adam, and also of Noah his father, who blessed him with the blessings of earth, so forth. But he sought diligently, he sought earnestly to imitate the order that went back to the fathers, the first generation, in the first patriarchal reign. Now, always the Egyptian ordinance has one purpose, to go back to the Pa'at. The Pa'at is the first time, the time of the first man, who was Adam, Tim. And that's the purpose. They didn't have it, and they knew they didn't have it. This is an interesting thing. Pharaoh is worried sick about this. Pharaoh spends his days in the Neferhotep papyrus, for example, and many others. He spends his days in the archives, searching through the genealogical records, with the nobles of the court in the house of life, turning over the records, says, looking for some genealogical proof that he really has authority. He never found it. It broke his heart. Pharaoh, being of that lineage where he could not have the right of the priesthood, notwithstanding, he would fain claim it from Noah. So he would fain claim the priesthood, and he made a very good imitation, seeking earnestly to imitate that order that went back to the beginning. So if you find what the Egyptian result is a very good imitation. So you'll see it does represent. Now we have the Joseph Smith Papyri 10 and 11. We won't go into this now. We just finished a very large book on that particular subject. And they are just simply our temple ordinance. That's all it is in the world. It just takes you right through the temple. And in the book it's called the Egyptian Endowment, we just take you through the Egyptian temple, and without any mention of the LDS temple at all. It's not necessary. You will see what's going on. But this is an open secret among scholars today, so we're not giving anything away. But they do have this common origin, and that's the clue. He says they did. They did imitate it. The rites of the Joseph Smith Papyri 10 and 11, known as the Book of Breathings, follow a perfectly familiar pattern. And to show that I'm not reading the pattern into it, I've included a number of early Jewish and Christian writings in an appendix, each dealing as Orthodox Jewish and Christian texts with the very same ordinances, which are since lost. The ancient temple ordinances were called mysteries. They are found in various degrees of preservation. If you ask, what did Joseph Smith know about real temples, I reply, everything. In this connection, there's an interesting sidelight on that word telestial, if we get to this. Long considered as one of Joseph Smith's more glaring indiscretions. We know now there are three worlds. This is what they teach: the terrestrial, in which we live, and the celestial, to which we aspire. But in between them is another world, which is called the celestial. It's neither one. It's not the terrestrial world we live on, but it is the world in between, and this is represented by the temple. According to the ancients. It's the in-between world where the rites of passage take place. That is represented by the temple. Indeed, the root telos, all this telestial, is a very rich word in this regard. It's been treated a lot recently. Namely, it deals with the mysteries. Telos means initiation. Teleomai means to be introduced into the mysteries. A poet versus Professor Jaeger, a very, very close friend of mine, Professor Jaeger at Harvard, who wrote the Paideia, was much exercised with that word teleotes. When he made his study of Gregor of Nazianzus, he said he was talking about the mysteries. Teleotes is a person who's been initiated into some ordinances or other, and is that kind of perfection. This word root appears first as indicating various steps from beginning to end of the initiation ordinances of the mysteries. In a recent book, just out this year, Morton Smith has shown at great length that the word mystery, as used by the early Jews and Christians, properly meant ordinance. and that the mystery of the kingdom, which Christ taught in secret to the apostles, was nothing else than a series of initiatory ordinances for achieving the highest salvation, which today are lost and unknown to the Christian world. He says we don't know what they are, but that's what Christ meant by the mysteries of the kingdom. He meant ordinances which were necessary, and these he revealed to the apostles during his very confidential teachings of the 40 days after the resurrection. The purpose of such ordinances is to bridge the space between the world in which we now live, the terrestrial world, and that to which we aspire, the celestial world. Therefore, the events of the temple were thought to take place in the celestial sphere. Remember, you leave the creation room, you leave the celestial, and you end up at the celestial, but nothing happens in the celestial. Everything happens in between, in the celestial. It doesn't happen after you leave the garden, then the fun begins, and until you get to the celestial, and then nothing. The whole temple represents teleotes. It's the telestial order of things. Now, that's a word that nobody used but Joseph Smith. He was the first one to use that word, telestial, and it means that very thing. The world in which we are placed in between the two, decide which way we're going to go. The purpose of the ordinances is to bridge the space between the world in which we now live, our terrestrial world, and that to which we aspire, the celestial world. Therefore, the events of the temple were thought to take place in that celestial sphere, the world of the mysteries or ordinances, what the Coptic text called the in-between world, the world of transition. It is a beautiful score for Joseph Smith. That one of the most famous of all temples was that at Jerusalem. In our day, there are strange stirrings as Jews and Christians begin speculating, be surprised how serious this is, too, on the advisability of reintroducing some form of temple activity, though they're embarrassed by such basic questions as what would we do with the temple and who should be in charge. But because of these new texts that are coming out, are all zeroing in on temple. All the new apocalyptic texts, all these things make that the center. The most famous one was that at Jerusalem. Well, in Christianity and Judaism, the temple played a strangely ambivalent role, which we've dealt with in a number of subject studies. They like it, but they're afraid of it. They don't know what to do about it. Being either too exalted, or else they minimize it as a mere building. When the temple stood, you see, it was the palladium of the nation, and it got to be sort of a fetish, what as we learn in Josephus and so forth. This led to the dangerous concept that as long as the people had the temple, its rights, they could consider themselves righteous and inviolable, and nothing would happen to them. Templum Dei, Templum Dei, Templum Dei is the temple of God. Nothing can hurt us. The same natural error hangs over the Latter-day Saints, incidentally, regarding it as sort of fetish. Sister Eve Nielsen, one of our great genealogists who works in the library at the BYU, specialized in genealogy, she tells that when she was a small girl, she and her brothers and sisters stood at the door of their house in Manti there, clinging to their mother's skirts during a terrible thunderstorm and looking at the temple. It had just been finished. Her father was up working on it. And they said to their mother, God will not let lightning strike the temple, will he? And just as her mother was assuring them that he would not, bang, lightning struck the east tower, which began to burn briskly. Sister Nielsen's father was working in the temple at the time, was in the crew that rushed up and soon put out the fire. When he came home, the children asked him what went wrong, what gives here. He explained to them that the installation of lightning rods had been discussed but not carried out. He said, God has given us the means of protecting the temple against lightning, and we neglected to use those means. Therefore, we had no right to expect miraculous interventions. God expects us to go on the same as ever. The temple in itself is not a fetish. It's not a genre. Because they attached their hopes in the end to a building, its destruction had the most crushing effect on the Jews. Remember, the Christians exulted that the Jews would never be restored again because the temple had been destroyed, and the Jews themselves felt utterly discouraged. With the passing of the temple, it was all over with. Everything was based on the building. And remember, the Lord points this out more than once. He invites them. He says, tear that temple down. Go ahead, tear it down. I'll rebuild it for you. They say, oh, that means the crucifixion. He'll give them a spiritual temple instead of it. And then he told the apostles when they sat on the Mount of Olives, he says, there's not going to be one stone left on another of that temple. But why have a building at all, then? The Christian doctors never tire of the old rhetorical cliches, a discourse on the vanity of putting one's faith in a building. Christ, we're told, destroyed the temple of stone, but the church is a spiritual temple and so forth. The only kind of temple that really counts. Do you have to have a physical temple? Right here we see the ambivalence of the argument. The very fathers, like Gregor of Nazianzus and John Chrysostom, who inveigh against the folly and idolatry of attributing sanctity to a mere place, a mere building. They're the first ones to join in the pious pilgrimage, go back to the ruins of the holy building for all sorts of things to Rome. The church never gave sanction to pilgrimages to the Holy Land. They didn't like it, but always opposed them. They say going back to the Holy Land. See, the pilgrimages were going back to the temple. They were simply Israel visiting the temple, is all. And for people to do that after the fall of the Jewish temple and so forth was a vote of no confidence in the church, and the church actually opposed it. There is no instance in which the church encouraged pilgrimages, which is rather surprising that they actually supposed. And it's the people that insisted on going back because they thought they could find the gospel if they went back there, get back to the old order of things. It was the sense of the Crusades. They were going back to the temple, to the Holy of Holies. It was the project of Columbus. He wished to discover the Indies to get enough money to rebuild the temple. The Protestant pilgrims, of course, denounced the folly of going there, and yet they've engaged with unsurpassed vigor and passion in that. All branches, especially the less ritually bound Christians, like Quakers and Adventists and so forth. They're the ones that love to make these pilgrimages back there, going back to the temple. The first great modern war was fought over the protection of the Crimean War, over the protection of the holy places. Everybody was concerned. World history actually pivots around the temple, not just Halford Mackinder's geopolitics, geographically centered in that part. There was the one part of the earth, you see, where the sea penetrates the world landmass to a great distance, which makes it the geopolitical center of the world, the strategic point for dominating the whole world, by sea or by land. But not only that, but as the ideological center of the temple there. Everybody, the 17th century, the great schemes and plans for getting the temple back and so forth, it's been an obsession with the Christian world. Even while it still toys with the idea of temple building, the modern world asks with lofty superiority, why a building? Why not a spiritual edifice? Does God need gadgets? Well, we're here in the world to familiarize ourselves with new medium. We may neither deny the reality of solid things nor be taken up too much with them. We shouldn't become hypnotized by them. The Oriental monks went to both extremes. They utterly denied the flesh and so became utterly obsessed with it as a result of it. Now, the Mormons have gone all out in the past to build temples, make great sacrifices of their means, yet they've not been attached to the buildings as such. No one ever worked as hard. He nearly worked himself to death, Brigham Young did, getting the Nauvoo temple built on time. But as he crossed the river, looked over his shoulder and saw the temple burning in Nauvoo, he rejoiced. He said, "Good Lord, you want it, take it. It's just a building after all." Well, then why should he knock himself out? See, we strive to make our temples beautiful. But if in the eyes of many of us, some of them turn out to be something less than breathtaking, well, that doesn't in the least dampen our enthusiasm for what goes on in them. My favorite temple is certainly the Provo Temple, though as a building I give it very low marks indeed. You see, we're not attached to buildings as such. It's an endowment house. Basic to all temples, is their exclusiveness and isolation. The temple is something set apart. Lord Raglan has written a lot about that. Each dispensation is marked by the return of the temple and its ordinances. The temple lies at the center of apocalyptic literature. Without a temple, they tell us, there's no true Israel, for there alone is the priesthood. With the destruction of the temple, the Jews also lost the priesthood, and the rabbis rejoiced. They're told as the temple was burning, the rabbis went to Vespasian and asked him, Titus was doing the job, and asked him for permission to build the first rabbinical school at Jamnia, and they rejoiced in the fall of the temple. And just as the Christian doctors rejoiced over the destruction of the temple, they gloated over it because it meant the end of the Jews. Without the temple, there could be no Judaism. And it can never come back again, and this is a theme that very much concerns them. When President Truman's emissary went back to make it in 1948 to Israel, he had a long discussion with the Pope, who made it very clear. He says the Jews, whatever happens, they must never build a temple. This is very important. They must never go back to Jerusalem because the prophecy is they can never go back. Well, odi et amo, it's alarmed and annoyed them, but it also fascinated them. They couldn't leave it alone. He said the basic institutions of civilization were defined ultimately from the temple, or derived from the temple. Many of those institutions became rivals, bitter rivals of the temple, and effectively displaced it. Thus the ancient sophists took over the education. When they took it over, the university became an anti-temple. which it's remained ever since, more or less, adopting the forms of the temple to discredit its teachings, its doctrines. In our day, as at various other times in history, the sanctity and authority of the temple have been preempted in here in the religion of Mammon, for example. Our banks are designed after the manner of ancient temples, with imposing columns, fanes, ceremonial gates and courts. The onyx, the marble, the bronze are all the substance of ancient temples. The sacred hush that prevails, the air of propriety, decorum, and dedication, the pious inscriptions in Zion's Bank, it's quotations from Brigham Young on the walls. The massive vault, the one man who really had it for business. Oh boy, Brigham Young on business is really a subject. The massive vault door through which only the initiated may pass, gleaming chastely in immaculate metal, the symbol, nay, the reality of all that is safe and secure. That is the Holy of Holies. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. We declare, well, it's the Lord speaking, we declare that our trust is in God, and we give ourselves away by stamping that declaration where it really belongs, on our coins and bills. As it comes and goes, dispensations, the temple is a bridgehead for Zion, preparing the way, a sort of outpost or outlook. It's an alien thing in the world, and as such, it is resented. It's feared and envied, viewed as an intruder, the dread and envy of them all, nay, as an invader in a wicked and adulterous world. It's on the defensive. Our early temples, notice, were all designed as fortresses with their buttresses and their battlements and their gates and so forth, walls, always surrounded by the wall. If the temple represents the principle of order in chaos, it also represents a foothold, you might say, of righteousness in a wicked world. When someone asked me concerning the Egyptian ordinances contained in the Joseph Smith manuscript, is this stuff relevant to the modern world? My answer was no. It is relevant to the eternities. The modern world is unstable as a changing isotope, but the temple has always been the same. The ordinances are those taught by an angel to Adam. The bringing of the temple into the world was a reminder of in the days of Enoch, of Noah, of Abraham, of Moses, of Christ, and of Joseph Smith, that the world, as a going concern, is coming to a close. That one phase of human existence was about to pass away and give place to another. One of the lessons of the recent scientific research in these many fields is that the course of history and geology, thinking of that Permo-Triassic catastrophe now, is not one of slow, infinitely gradual, salutary evolution. The Lord told the prophet Joseph Smith in the first vision that he was fed up with the world. He said, "There is none that doeth good, no, not one," and he was about to remove it. We are told that the sudden, total, catastrophic house cleaning, which is to take place when the condition of saturation has been reached, when the people are ripe in iniquity. The name of the church will not let us forget that these are the last days. The last days of what? Of the rule of Belial, of the rule of Satan on this earth. Now, in the temple, we first learn by what means Satan has ruled the world and how it came about, and how he's ruled the world all these many years. And then we proceed to lay the foundation for that order of earthly existence which God intends his children to have here. In both lessons, we deal with specific things. We are given a choice between them, and to that degree to which we live up to the principles and laws of the temple, in which we don't live up to him, we are in the power of the other kingdom. It's in the temple that God puts the proposition on the line, and he will not be mocked. The temple is there to call us back to our senses, to tell us where our real existence lies, to save us from ourselves. So let us go there often and face a reality, brethren and sisters. Now, we testify to the truth of the existence of these things. We say, what did Joseph Smith know about the temple? He knew everything about it. He's given us the complete thing. So we know that the gospel has been restored, and the temple is the center of things. It's an interesting thing now. So we must prepare there often. I'm almost an addict now. I can't keep away from that temple. I revel in it. The building, I call it an endowment house. It's lacking in many of the aspects of nature, but that doesn't make any difference. We can see the ordinances and endowments. It's built for practical purposes. There was a speech that Brother Erastus Snow gave in the 1880s in St. George. He says every temple has a slightly different design because it performs a different purpose from others. He says, now the St. George Temple was built after the pattern of the Kirtland Temple to emphasize certain things. And our Provo Temple is built in a different way entirely. It's functionally with a different thing in mind, emphasizing efficiency of getting a lot of work done in a hurry, but also as a teaching tool. It's interesting, in 1897, they discovered a document called the the apocalypse of Abraham, and it's marvelous. Abraham is there showing the ordinance, but he's showing them in a moving picture. He's showing them projected on a screen. And the angel who's instructing him says, now you see this. Now you see this picture. You walk with me in the garden. This is a picture of the Garden of Eden. And Abraham says, and who is the man there? He says, now that's Adam, and the woman is Eve. And I'll tell you about it. And he goes through, and then he takes him to the next picture, as if it were projected on a screen. Any means we can use to convey the information, to convey the knowledge, will fulfill the Lord's purposes. So no two temples are built alike. Remember what Brigham Young said when they started to build the St. George Temple with only 2 towers instead of 6. He says, don't everybody apostatize because we're having 2 instead of 6 towers, because it's not built in the same pattern. But, well, brothers and sisters, now you said there'd be some questions. That doesn't make any difference. The world, we live in Vanity Fair today, and the temple represents the one sober spot in the world where we can really be sober and consider these things. Is my testimony the gospel has been restored, and the Lord intends to fulfill his purposes in these days, and that whatever we ask him for, he will give us. This I tell my family without any reservation whatever. I have never asked the Lord for anything that he didn't give me to me. You say, well, he certainly didn't ask for much in that case, considering what he'd given you. No, I didn't. I was very careful not to ask for much. We don't want to be spoiled brats here, do we? You know, we ask for what we need, for what we cannot get ourselves, and the Lord will give it to you. Don't worry. But he wants you to get in and dig for the rest, too. So I pray and hope that the Lord may inspire and help us all and become more engaged, more involved in the work of these latter days, and visit the temple often and often, and become wiser all the time. Because he intends to give us more revelations through that instrumentality. I pray for this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.